السنة لعن الله من ذبح لغير الله. ودليل النذر قوله تعالى يوفون بالنذر ويخافون يوما كان شره مستطيرا.
بسم الله. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبد الله ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأزواجه الطيبين الطاهرين أمهات المؤمنين وعلى صحابته الغر الميامين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. ثم أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. أجارنا الله وإياكم من سامئ من نار. آمين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا ما علمتنا وزدنا علما ولا تكلنا إلى أنفسنا طرفة عين واجعل ما علمتنا إياه هجة لنا لا علينا. إخوة المباركون، ما زال حديثنا موصولا معكم مع هذا الكتاب المبارك هو أصول الثلاثة أو ثلاثة أصول وأدلتها لشيخ الإسلام محمد بن عبد الوهاب بن سليمان التميمي رحمه الله رحمة واسعة. قال ودليل الاستعانة قوله تعالى إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. وفي الحديث إذا استعنت فاستعن بالله. قالت سبحانه وتعالى تسلك إلى إمام صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم atol barim bunyaron bam fanyo ka ñong hakkilo bulandi kitab wala min keda yillasil saboti min Sheikh al-Islam la kitab min keda Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab bin Sulaiman at-Tamimi rahimahullahu ta'ala. Komando ay anwa'ul ibada aya fala ko ngata bindinu nyami ay al-Islam wala maratibud din al-Islam wal iman wal ihsan thumma tabahu bi arba'ati anwa'in min anwa'il ibada wa kolanata tandin nani bulandano min kada alabatola nonolut comme khawfo be nyamin tambitala wal inaba tambitol mume bel bi ay men sama wala nyende ko al isti'an sin woni intani tufidu madha at-talab talab al-awn طلب العون من الله سبحانه وتعالى. وهي تجمع الثقة بالله والاعتماد عليه مع كمال الذل له كما قال ابن القيم رحمه الله تعالى. قال والاستعانة بالله تتضمن ثلاثة أمور: كمال الذل له مع الثقة به والاعتماد عليه. ومن استعان بغير الله محققا هذه المعاني الثلاثة فقد أشرك مع الله غيره. مدارج السالكين. الاستعانة ولن كدمارون عرب سبحانه وتعالى طلب الأول كوسا با ولا كفني فلو كلا على ولا كلا على ولا مكاتروس الله سبحانه وتعالى الثقة به بالله والاعتماد عليه أنك توكل وأن توكل كدم كلهم مع كمال الذل له كفنين ينفي كفما جيو بيدن نسير كاد عليه سبحانه وتعالى يمن كل سبا ولا كفنين يوم يلا على لا يتوكو عليك يفما جي عليه فما جيو بيدن زي ولن كدمارو يناو ولان ابن القيم ياهو رحمه الله أكو استعانة أي طلب العون من الله تتضمن ثلاثة أمور أكا يكوسا بلا كفنين يوم ولن كمال الذل له فما جيو بي كمال لمياك عليه مع الثقة به كفرين في يتر لارين على الله سبحانه وتعالى والاعتماد عليه يتر تندن أتى على قال ومن استعان بغير الله أكو مومو ديمارون على تنوبل محققا هذه المعاني الثلاثة ينم من كل سبول بي توني نوتو على تنوبل فقد أشرك مع الله غيره ويفندو كفو علمل ممن كارتي سبحانه وتعالى دليل
The Sheikh, he says today the scholar he was first mentioned the dalil. He says والدليل استعانة قوله تعالى إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. He said the Sheikh, he says, and the proof for having this seeking aid in Allah, seeking help in Allah, he says Allah, he mentioned the ayah, in you only you will worship and only you will seek help in. He says, and in the hadith the Prophet he says, if you seek help in Allah. He says the scholar he mentioned prior to this, before today's class, about ibadah and the categories of ibadah, which are Islam, Iman and Ihsan, and he mentioned other parts such as khawf, inaba and khashya. He says today he speaks about isti'ana. He says this isti'ana is seeking help, seeking aid from Allah. He says its meaning is that the person, he does three things: seeking, rather having trust in Allah, that's the first one. The second one, relying upon Allah, having reliance only upon Allah. And the third one, being humble towards Allah to the greatest extent. He says these three things are what isti'ana means. The person must trust Allah, must rely upon Allah, and must be humble to Him to the greatest extent. He says, Ibn Qayyim, may Allah have mercy on him, he mentioned that whoever has this isti'ana, the first one being, the first part of which being humble to the highest level towards Allah, to bring yourself down to the highest level of humility as you can possible. He says, and then trusting in Allah alone with the greatest amount of trust, and then relying upon Him as well. He says this is what isti'ana means. He says, and whosoever has isti'ana with all of these categories combined, he has this in anyone other than Allah, then the person has indeed committed shirk.
نعم. دليل أقول إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. هذا العهد الذي بين العبد وربه ينم الله هدوتي جون أماريتهما. كان هذا حديث أبو هريرة يامي قال سبحانه وتعالى حديث القدسي كابوكو قسمت الصلاة بيني وبين عبدي. أكون مسألة تلاننا جون ينتما من جون ينكو الحمد لله رب العالمين على سبب حمدني عبدي نياكو تندو بعلي من كده دافعون بيه ماريوت دافعون بيه دار لا منسو دافعون بيه كلور لا منسو ومن سبحانه وتعالى على سبب كنا جون ينتندو ناكو الرحمن الرحيم على سببكو أثنى علي عبدي نجوم في الدائن جاي ناكو مالك يوم الدين كافوكو نيولا جولو مر الله منسو مالت أتلمو منسو دي ميمبا مرلن كول مو ميبين أسافوكو مجدني عبدي نجوم في الدين أي ويركنت أني كامبونيان ناكو جام إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين أكاب هذا بين عبدي بيني وبين عبدي، هذا العهد بيني وبين عبدي. ولا أن كلا صلى الله عليه وسلم كل مولود يولد على الفطرة، يعني الفطرة من معناه الإسلام، فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها لا تبديل لخلق الله. يوم بين جدكنا إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. أبرا عليه من في سورة الأعراف وارب آدم الذرة أي بين كاكوك ألست بربكم قالوا بلى. فندل من قال ماريوت مو بلا صندا يقول أنت رب قالوا بلى بلا صندا. ولا أن ينم الله إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. إذا على دم بدي مارو يدي على دم مال بقول عفوا بيت على دم مال بطل أي نخصك بالعبادة وحدك، نخصك وحدك بالعبادة، أي لا نعبد غيرك. هذا تعاهد بين العبد وربه، لا هدو لم يالنكو جمعي ولا سلانا ماريوت. نسأل الله السلامة والعافية. يلا هدو لياتنا أرسل الرسل وأنزل الكتب. يلا هدو ولا أن كلار يامر عليك أنا ولا أن كتاب ولا كيت اسكيلار يامر نار كمول حكيلو بلندي ينا رسل المبشرين ومنذرين لئلا يكون للناس على الله حجة بعد الرسل. موكنا ولوصل علم سبحانه وتعالى كلار يامر كيوكولا إياك نعبد أي نخصك وحدك بالعبادة. إذا أجن تقديم المفعول على معمول بنا على العامل على الفعل، فهذا يدل الحصر. أراب الله كمله من يند لبنا كم من يند لبنا نيا فلون داك من تند كورين كتلو ولا يند كا كمن دا كم يا بي مرمر نابم كم على بتو من يند كلا في يدا من كلا دم سبحانه وتعالى. وكذلك وإياك نستعين أي نفردك بالاستعانة دون خلق. بيتا دما بيتا الكلم باندلا كدي مارون يني إذا على دما سبحانه وتعالى من ديتا نومان كلم. ورانا شيخ الإسلام ابن تيمية رحمه الله تعالى قال الدين أن لا يعبد إلا الله ولا يستعان إلا به. لأن مدار الدين على العبادة والاستعانة. أكو دينو كمرمر منك ولا يند على بتو أنك دمارو يند على سبحانه وتعالى.
The Sheikh, he says, he repeated the dalil. He says, Allah, he said in the ayah that only you we worship and only you we seek help in. He said, this is the trust, this is the oath, the promise that was taken between Allah and His servants. He says, as it comes in the hadith of Ibn Abbas, where the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that Allah, he divided the prayer between him and the servant. Allah, he divided the prayer between him and his servant. When his servant, he says, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, all praise is due to Allah. Allah, he responds by saying, my servant has praised me. When he says, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most gracious, the most merciful, Allah, he responds by saying, my servant has exalted me. When he says, Maliki Yawmiddin, he says, my servant has glorified me. When he says, Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in, he says, the servant is saying here, Allah, only you we worship, and Allah, only you we seek help from. He says, Allah, he responds, he says, this is the oath, this is the promise that was taken between me and my servant. He says, so this worshipping Allah alone and seeking help in Allah alone, it is a promise that was taken by the servant between him and his Lord. He says, this has been clarified in the hadith. He says, as Allah, he mentioned in Surah Al-A'raf, when he said, Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord? He says, of course, indeed his creation would respond to say, yes, now indeed you are our Lord, the only one who deserves to be worshipped and the only one who seeks help. He says, for this reason, the messengers were sent and the books were revealed. He says, the messengers were sent to remind us of this promise that we took, and they were sent with books to remind us of this promise as well. He says, in the Arabic language, Iyaka, when Allah is mentioned first here, it is signifying that this act of worship is meant only for Allah. He says because the subject, the Allah here, the one that is being referred to here is mentioned first. He says in the Arabic language, when this happens, then that means the action is meant solely and only for Allah. So meaning worship here, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, is meant only for Allah, and the act of seeking help as well, وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, is only meant for Allah. He says this is why Ibn Taymiyyah, may Allah have mercy upon him, he said that the deen, it all goes around worshipping Allah, number one, and then number two, seeking help in Allah alone.
نعم وأنا لون ناريات الاستعانة هو أربعة ولا مياه كاوت والاستعانة عبادة عظيمة ومما يعين عليها قول لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. قال شيخ الإسلام رحمه الله وقول لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله يوجب الإعانة، ولهذا صنع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا قال المؤذن حي على الصلاة فيقول المجيب لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله، متفق عليه. استعانة طلب العون من الله سبحانه وتعالى عبادة عظيمة. أنا بدور الموارد أكمل ما قول ولا يندفع لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. حول ولا أرك ولا الحال كافلين ياتنا الحال لا فلين تيجي مول كافو فيرول باري كم لون نال كافسر والحول جام كم ساك حالة فلين كذا حالة وسمبوت هذا ما دمنا نين في كو سمبوت القوة ينتلا نوتلا نامن كالله سبحانه وتعالى. على لك مولا الحال فلين كيف كنا الحال كده أتسمى الحال ده. so nyembe hada madu nyande kelal lamfo tande ala la subhanahu wa ta'ala ni aje Sheikh Lisa yintande ko madarul ad-din ala hadin al-asl bi ana al-ibadatu wal isti'ana yos arabatu ala yedda wala kam fulan jawite arabatu no la foka de maro nyina arabu subhanahu wa ta'ala ni nga ko bismillah ba min na taje lonna ka min ko ya bil isti'ana al-isti'ana ika barako nyina min nabiyana al-isti'ana وتبارك بسم الله سبحانه وتعالى كدي مارو نين على بول سبحانه نين على تو نين pour ala si de may be ko ko ken wala ne femu femu ku ken do ni ba ko e ka ko bismillah ala to kam be wala ala barakatillah asta'inu bismillah subhanahu wa ta'ala ala to nyin wala na Sheikh al-Islam ko kila ya ka sunno sallallahu alaihi wasallam ni wada Allah ko hayya ala as-salah ya safa ni wada Allah wada no foka naka Allahu akbar ita min bala moyka ifanan sa sayinka fa nafuda hatta idha wasala ila bi an hayya ala as-salah taqulu la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah sa ke kuma min ga wala ala batut wa ala batut man sona ala ko innaha la kabiratun illa ala al-khashi'in al-khushu' ni ngafujan al-khushu' tadharu fil qalbi wa fil basari wa fil sawt mu'min ma famaji alay amanyin sodo khushu' famaji o min sika silamati ay findala nyaata findala nam ko da salo keno o de ba la hawla wala quwwata illa billah kayfan kolonyel mumbe bedo katande ko fendela al halu falina andu sembete naman ka arada mati subhanahu wa ta'ala.
The Sheikh, he says, and this is why the scholars they say isti'ana is a great act of worship. He says, as the statement comes, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there is no might to change a person's condition or anyone's affair, and there is no power except with Allah. He says here, the hawla, la hawla wa la quwwata. He says la hawla here. He says as the scholars they explain, it means there is no one who can change somebody's condition. There is no one who can change an affair except Allah, and no one has the power to do so except Allah. He says, so the servant must show his weakness to Allah. He must show Allah that he is weak and he is not capable of doing anything except by the help of Allah. He says, you cannot worship Allah except by his aid, and so the servant must seek help in Allah. He says, this is why whatever we do, especially in the beginning of the prayer, what do we say? He says, we say Bismillah. He says the B here, the Ba here, it is seeking, we are saying in the name of Allah. In actuality, in reality, we are seeking the help of Allah. He says because anything good that we do, we want to seek Allah's help and His blessing. He says this is why it is from the Sunnah that we always start, when we start in good things, we say Bismillah, in the name of Allah, seeking the help of Allah and seeking His aid. He says this is also the reason why in the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, when the Mu'adhin, he says, Hayya ala salah, we are advised and commanded to say, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. He says, because why the Mu'adhin is calling us to pray and to worship Allah. He says, indeed, no one can pray and worship Allah except by His aid. He says, this is why Allah, He says, وَإِنَّهَا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ, that indeed it is heavy upon the creation except those who have this khushu. He says this khushu none of us can have except by the help of Allah. He says so the person, the servant, he should seek help in Allah to worship Him, and he should know that he is weak and is not capable of doing anything except by the help of Allah.
وقد أمر الأنبياء أقوامهم بالاستعانة بالله وحده. قال سبحانه: قال موسى لقومه استعينوا بالله واصبروا. ولأن النبي مولوي لمولي أمر كل كدي مارون على دم موسى عليه السلام أي من فعل مولي بني إسرائيل كل أقول استعينوا بالله أي اطلبوا العون من الله سبحانه وتعالى واصبروا. على دي مارون على بون أدم عليه السبب. وأمر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بالاستعانة بالله فقال في الحديث الذي رواه الترمذي قال إذا استعنت فاستعن بالله. ينال في حديث ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما كلا كاغا صلى الله عليه وسلم ني بدي مارو ني لا اساغين على دماغول سبحانه وتعالى.
The Sheikh, he says Allah, He commanded the prophets with this action of seeking help in Allah alone, and so they did advise their communities, their followers. He said, like Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, he used to command his followers, Ista'inu billahi wasbiru, seek help in Allah alone and be patient. He says this act of worship is to be done only for Allah. This is why it came in the hadith. The Prophet he said, وَإِذَا اسْتَعَنْتَ فَاسْتَعِنْ بِاللَّهِ. He says the prophets, they were commanded with this, and so they would advise their followers to do the same thing. He said the Prophet he commanded us, if we seek help, that we seek help only in Allah.
Sheikh, the left in Yininka. Kamu Yininka, I do ake.
Alhamdulillah, nyaro mal. Afwan, mampuda fangwa isti'ana bil makhluq aidan min awal to tensai. Al isti'anatu bil makhluq. نعم. قال الشيخ: ولا بأس بالاستعانة بالمخلوق الحي على أمر قادر عليه، فإن كانت على بر وخير فهي إحسان. قال سبحانه وتعالى: وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى. وإن كانت على إثم فهي حرام. قال جل وعلا: ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان. وأما الاستعانة بالأموات أو بالأحياء الغائبين أو بالأحياء الحاضرين على أمر لا يقدرون عليه فهذا شرك. أكو تانوتي جي كرو موي دي مارو ني نيون جومول ميم بي بالوري كولا سمين كين اسافو نو مو ماكو ني ماكو يسيرون سما طلبت منه العون مساعدة. نعم. واسمين كينو فإن كان على بر وخير nin kayro lam anin kuken do lam e kolto la ihsanu kube to la woti ala ko wa ta'awanu 'alal birri wat taqwa liman ya'mul yanta wala kal al birru jam fana mu ismul jami li kulli khair birru wo ku betiyata an yanta nyon de malaka na muslimu wat taqwa ni ala nyasila al sinyon ko de mawaka wa in kana ala ismin fa hiya haram bal nin ka nyum fasani e junube ko wala kam wa haram yata ala ko wala ta'awanu 'alal ismi wal 'udwan. Alkana nyom fasa wakan alkana nyon de ma wakan judube kolu anin jawya ko anara ko amal isti'anatu bil amwat barka de maro nyeni fu rewrugul al amwat al maqbur alladhi la qudrata lahu inma mata al insan mahma wasala min al walayati la yastadibana an yaghsila nafsahu wa yukaffina nafsahu ويدفن نفسه ما يستطيع نعم هذا ما دم فدا على ولي فدا بلاسو بلاسو نا فدا دا فان كونول ادا فان كسانكينول اتا فان بعدين ودو من فن الضعيف عندما تطلب منه ايه العون. واما الاستعانه بالاموات او بالاحياء الغائبين ولا بالبلوري اني من ترجونك كم دول بيانكم من غلاة الصوفيه الى مشايخ الاستعانه يستعينون بامواتهم يعني نيتا دلك بدي مارون ليبول المدد شيخ فلان. وبالاحياء الغائبين ايضا إذا شيخ الملي على كوي من ترى كده حنا كوكيد لا درو بسبب يا شيخ فلان هي إن تعالى سبحانه وتعالى كاجا ولا بيكلام أو بالأحياء الحاضرين ولا بالبلور يبكن بما بين على أمر يدمرون يبلغون لا يقدرون عليه نيكا ويكنديان كورام بلاريكا يكا كورام بنديكا إكاي فواريا بنديكا والله دي مدي هيدا لو كاتو كينو أكو فهذا شرك يعني الاستعانة بالأموات وبالأحياء الغائبين وبالأحياء الحاضرين على أمر لا يقدرون عليه فهذا شرك ومو فلان كفرت. أما يكمل من ينكر الدعاء دبير الدعاء كافم موي دعاء ومن كتنا المسلمين إيش أفهم موي دعاء أليس دعاء كانوا مسلم ولا بين ظهر الغيب ومو من وسائل كم سا وكندو لياجكم مو كندوتي mo kana fallon da palasot comme kaaje ko le be kala duwala mo de pour la haajo ja alal mo haajo ja Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bar ñendol ka wasailul lit yaaje li wasila amanka wasila min be inda sufiya famul wasiya inda sufiya la amanka wa ne waytulu hada indahum bi an yaqulu man la shaykha lahu fa shaytan shaykhuhu fa in kana hatta shaykhuka hada huwa shaytan al akbar na'am fa waliyadu billah شيخ من يندى تريبول من يندى كالمرشد ميانكم موجه بيلون دي لسلوكا كي كارن كيلون على الكتاب ولا نكيل على الرسول أكن ينيات لنا دفع أي نيات لنا على الله سبحانه وتعالى دعاء هيك وكينهم بين كيلا صلى الله عليه وسلم يا عمر بن الخطاب كفايني ويس القرن من اليمن عنده من التابعين عمر بن الخطاب له في سياته بري كيلا فايكو صلى الله عليه وسلم بندا أسيدوان ينابلا دعاء ومكو كندو دي ويسي تتبارو من كم أكتا بارا لوالدته ويسي القرن كان بارا لوالدته برا جيبه مو كندو وادا كان نكونا كبورل برا كان بلا لك سيدا كبيرو ويسي نينكي بارو فيندي دا مول نياتلي دال ويسي بورتا مول كون لا يما amal la fi moy ataral lalo to bar sa mol ka iddia ke babala ko duwa jaabi moro ya ke sabe ila fenge bal wala to do ato na duwa jaabi moro ide ya lo nyaadi la ko la duwa jaabi te e ka baro mingi dia ya kila sallallahu alaihi wasallam be fa anda ale wala duwa jaabi mu alla mo kendol ke dara wosi ale ka kumbo ale subhanahu wa ta'ala ale la misalul humili allon ko ke la barakenul samana bari be silar aisha ya kila ngin ka sallallahu alaihi wasallam ikatara silar fonna nyem baro nyem fa ale amda wallahi mamuta sai de be modo garantie te me fan garantie de be modo garantie la nyaadi ka fa ko la nyin duwa be jaabi ibo garanti la nyaadi ida be keno duwa jaabi moro to nyaadi wala de na momo ya alalon subhanahu wa ta'ala ka fa ko fala silam se wa alal kum san ngatam da khashiya to nyaadi wala do li ka fa ba fa le ron kuma da asude la kuma kan do ron ila fa alon da din kiral do ron wosi wada isaja si samare atala fa fa lo ya mo ka fa ne ko alada mo be alada hana tara kullo da be duwale gos kila wa sallallahu alaihi wasallam ne muslimo duwata ñom muslimo e kullo to wo duwa ka jaabe ko mo ne wulula duwata de moy jaabe tamala fa nan bo ñam yelbe mu fenne de mi alon ko ka fa moy ko kana ñenan ne la duwa ken dolul ila duwal ko ne kan to bulandi na wo manke ka e timado ñin ka wala de na londal ya tan de ñin manku do sabul miliyalo nga fa isti'anatu kamalul dhullu lahu subhanahu wa ta'ala وثقة به والاعتماد عليه ويو كفيون فندو منك على تدرون إما إسالة مفلان كفمود على دم ما ينتهي على دم مال تروسلا إلى دم مال ينو ينتو عندي ينتهي تنتين على دم مال كم إلى دم مال ينو ينتو an yande fammaji latale fammaji o be dan nasirin wala ata ala damma subhanahu wa ta'ala nin jomale nyenke wallahi ni tada kuburinol kaminka kabro neew ka ale ibe kala min awliya ibatara mun ko moy ka tazallu ko dullo min so de fayi ika khushuwa min so do dinkira niyo so ale wallahi be kala ala mo cendol bari ka ala la jomay ka kuruntu wala duma ibe munu wala duma kaje ko wala be ko mu me be kele ibe ñenere ala mi yo so do subhanahu wa ta'ala nasallallahu salamata wal afiyah.
The Sheikh, he says the hadith reminded us, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, if you seek help in Allah alone. He says seeking help from people to help you in good actions, he says there is no problem in that. Asking the creation, asking your friends, people around you to help you to do something good, he said this doesn't go against seeking help in Allah. He says there is no problem in this. He says rather this is good. He says because Allah, he says ta'awanu ala birri wa taqwa, help each other in righteousness and fearing Allah. He says so if the servant asks other people to help him, for example to move a chair or to do something other than that which they can do, he says then there is no problem with this. He says the servant can do so, asking people for help to help him to carry out some of his actions. He says there is no problem with this. He says but if the person, he goes out asking people to help him to commit a sin or to do some evil act, he says then this is wrong and is not permissible. He says because Allah, he says وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ, do not help each other in sin, transgression and committing evil acts. He says so it is not permissible for a person to seek help in doing wrong things. He says the same thing, it is not permissible for a person to seek help from the dead, from people who are not alive, like those who go and worship the grave and ask the people inside their grave to help them. He says these people are dead. No matter how great they were of a wali, of a good Muslim, a good mu'min, someone who was a high status in the eyes of Allah, he said no matter how great they were when they were alive, when they are dead, they cannot even help themselves. He says they cannot wash their own body, they cannot shroud themselves, they cannot bury themselves. So if they cannot help themselves, how can they help you? He says so it is not allowed to seek help in these people who have passed away. He says the same thing, it is not allowed to seek help from those people who seek help from their shuyukh when their shuyukh are not around. He says number one, it is not allowed to seek help from the dead, and then number two, it is not allowed to seek help from people who are alive but absent. They are not present in our sitting, in our area, in our gathering. He says there are some people who follow their shuyukh to such an extent that they worship them. Even if they are not around, if they are in difficulty, if they are scared, they will call the name of their shuyukh to seek help from him. He says, subhanallah, this is something that is a grave act. He says it is not permissible to do so. He says also, it is not permissible to ask help to those who are alive. They are not dead like the first group, and they are also not absent like the second group. So they are alive and they are around you, but you ask them for something that they cannot help you. He said that this is not permissible. He says the example, like you asking someone to cure your sick people. He says they cannot cure them. Or asking someone to bring richness to your poor people. He says they cannot do so. He says anyone who commits these acts, asking the dead, asking help from their shuyukh that are not around, or asking people to do things that they cannot do, like curing the sick, he says then this is shirk. He says, as the Sheikh asks the question, he says asking someone to make dua for you, because the people, they do that. They will go to someone whom they believe is a good person, like the imam or a brother in the community who is good. They will say, please make dua for me. He says there is no problem in this. There is nothing wrong with that, in asking good people to make dua for you. He says, but a person should not sit in his house and make it his day job or night job, which is what they usually do, to say, I get my prayers answered, or I'm a person whose prayers always get answered. So he advertises himself on the newspapers and everywhere, that on the radio, that he's someone, you even hear in the radios, that he's someone who can answer prayers. He said this is not permissible. No one should sit in his house to call people towards himself to say, if you come to me, I will pray for you and the prayer will be accepted. He says no one should do so. He says this is why the Sufis, this is the sort of action that they do, and this is why they say they seek help in their Sheikh, and this is why they say whosoever doesn't have a Sheikh, then his Sheikh is the Shaitan. He says even if that person his Sheikh is the Shaitan, your Sheikh is an even greater Shaitan, because he is bringing people towards evil, and he is claiming that he is someone who can get his prayers answered when this is not something that is true. He says there is nothing wrong with this, as it comes in the narration. The Prophet ﷺ, he told Umar ibn Khattab when he meets Uwais al-Qarni to seek help from him by telling him to make dua for him. He says, and Umar ibn Khattab was a Sahabi and Uwais was a Tabi. But the Prophet ﷺ told Umar to tell this Tabi to make dua for him because he was such a righteous person and he was so good and dutiful to his parents. He says, so there is no problem in seeking help or asking these sort of people to make dua for you. He says, but even those people whom you ask to make dua for you, if they are truly righteous people, they will run away from it. He says the same thing Uwais al-Qarni he did. When the people started coming to him and they knew of this, they would go to him and ask him to make dua for him, or to make dua for them rather. He ran away and he hid from the people so that nobody would know where he was. He says this is the action of good people. If people come to you, tell you make dua for me, make dua for me, you should tell them to go make dua for themselves. He says even if you make dua for them in secret, you should tell them to go and make dua for themselves. He says the Sahabas, they were scared and they used to think if Allah accepted their prayers, and they were scared of Allah not even accepting their own deeds. He said, so how can you be a person who would guarantee other people to accept your deeds? He says this is not permissible. He says whoever knows Allah and he fears him, then he will make dua for the people. Even if he does it in secret, he will tell them to go and make dua for themselves. He says this is permissible because in the hadith the Prophet he said that when a person he sits in private, in secret, and he makes dua for another brother, Allah accepts it. He says like the dua of the parent, the dua of the traveler, and so on. He says, so this is why the scholar he said, when you seek help only in Allah. When you rely as well, rely only upon Allah and have trust in Allah alone. He says these three, if you have all of them combined, then you will have the true action of isti'ana. Now, he says, the last point he made, he says, these kuburiyun, those who go to the graveyards and they worship the dead people in the grave, he said, if they feared Allah the same way they had fear and khushu and khashya, they had this fear and humility and humbleness towards the dead people in the grave, if they feared Allah the same way, then they will become from the highest saints, the highest friends of Allah.
قصة دو بيجي ميارو مو بحكي ما إسافة إنجلون ندو ما بنونجا أقوات من أنا كده كم بيارون كو جانا كيد كو بنيام يو تعالى بودو كم كني مو سيفا دول ميل كده كيد من ترى تفعل كندو ما يكو فم مولينيا توبتوي إلى كل بيبسوني على إلى كيد كل فم كل ndo manala ada falanka ko bari ko ba yo sara condition lo ite ba fo lende ite bende ma pe ite fa la condition ko aka fo ko sa di ate so ke ko ite ke no le fa ba ye fam fengen aka fa tilinda aka kai wallahi kuma ka wonye akole yalla bari yemen bolam tonya ni adara no sa ke no modoy ni adda ke on fa fo do نسأل الله السلامة والعافية. ودليل الاستعاذة قوله تعالى قل أعوذ برب الفلق وقل أعوذ برب الناس. الاستعاذة أيضا هي طلب الالتجاء والالتجاء والاعتصام والتحرز، وحقيقتها الحرب من شيء تخافه إلى من يعصمك منه. استعاذة نيافن نكون ولا أفو كاسر ياسكير فتجته كاسا kasaro ha
Kasaro.
fahimde ya famle
No, ma o pam.
yala ni dinde mo nyem ne dinde mo nen modo dun tanyon ake bolla ka menen men ko makana ake kasala pour nyen kama ko aya tanka yaje yala iltijaka ken ane i'tisam ta tasen bi se wa taharruz fa nan ko may se bara so ka tankaro ke ni fonte ha san sama da bar comme ça na fa min nyen kawon mum be ka fol eke kasa comme kasaro بس على فلور في الجارب قال الحرب من شيء تخافه إلى ما يعصمك منه ولا يقول فملا إسلام تمنا يتا فين كم يعلم كل بيتان كلا وفملا نعم ها نعم يا رأي بعد الدنيا بيننا أنا برو بيننا كلا أساسي كوا موكم بري ولا بفنجر الاستعاذة على ما نكناني ولا ورسائل الاستعاذة من كافو جم هو الالتجاء إلى الله ودان هذا ما دم تنقوني العرب سبحانه وتعالى كي كاسا على واعتقاد كفايته وتمام حماية من كل شر توكو على الكادر تند كادر مال بي وصل عند دم مال بي تنكر كول ممبين تمام حماية من كل شر وهي عبادة من العبادات التي أمر الله عباده بها كما قال تعالى وإما ينزغنك من الشيطان نزغ فاستعذ بالله علىك يا مرلوك جم كلا صلى الله عليه وسلم أنا لمن تقول تمان دو بار شيطانو لا مرسا كول سينيكا شيطانو هذا ما دي مجاورة أكايكو إسي تنكروني على رب سبحانه وتعالى بس على دمال شي تنكرون فاستعذ بالله قرآن وبنا نيبنا كرامكم بس شيطانو من نجاورة قالوا ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم فإذا قرأت القرآن فاستعذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولا أن كذا سنة نبي القرآن وكريكافكم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم حتى أصابتها عند المحققين حتى صلوا بس عند المالكية يتوليا كانوا دام سنة فنقو دام نافلو bari ay ko farro ko ne manya na furaje bara sabata indal muhaqqiqin kaje ko si isti'adha nyin keno bari ka fa duma isti'adha nyin ibafala duma a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim bismillahir rahmanir rahim qira'a min mujahariyat salo min ka fasal isna alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin iso sikande sal yembe ka tan ko nyin arabul ko shaitano wata wada kala fika hadama de mudundi problème nyin kon fende tan karawol wala ko wala asima في تفريج الكروب ورفع الخطوب سوى رب العالمين والحياة مليئة بالآفات والمكاره ولكل مخلوق أعداء من الجن والإنس وعلى مقدمته إبليس لعنه الله قال سبحانه إن الشيطان لكم عدو فاتخذوه عدوا وأخبر الله أن لكل نبي أعداء من الجن والإنس قال سبحانه وكذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا شياطين الإنس والجن يوحي بعضهم إلى بعض زخرف القول غرورا نعم أكو هذا ما موديتان كلاجين بلا يقول مومي بلا نامك علس قبل هذا شيخ عبد الرحمن حفيد شيخ الإسلام محمد بن عبد الوهاب ما مي كتاب وشريكه مي فتح المجيد كتاب التوحيد أيال شرحه ولا كافي فتح المجيد أهو قد أجمع العلماء على أنه لا تجوز الاستعاذة بغير الله إنك تنكر نيرو من فجم لنار بيكم بندوكا من دا يعني نفهم بلنا من كالاتي سبحانه وتعالى ولا نعتندكو فهم بك موتان كان دي ماسي بقول مبيل وسنيام استعاذة كان دي مو بقول يقول كن فهم بك وبندن نامن كالاتي كدنيا بيبي فارو بروبلم ولن وقول يقول لن أنه هذا ما دي وهذا ما دي ye jawol soro jinolu to adama de mulut akoy la nyaaton ko wala iblis ala la dam ko nyum ba ala ko inna shaytana lakum aduwwun fattakhidhuhu aduwwa shaytanu mal jawlati alfana li amutal jawlati كذلك عليه خلافنا النبي مون كبار ول ko annabi mu annabi shaytanu be bul milka de jawlati ألكو كذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا شياطين الإنس والجن أبولا جماعة النبي عليه جول كيل الشيطان الكون أني جنول كون شياطين جنول كون أني أدم أدم يوحي بعضهم إلى بعض زخرف القول غرورا والإكنين يركم والفنيوي فنلا إيحاء وجعل إيحاء بأن يكون الإخبار والإعلام وحي فمود إخبار في السر أكناني إعلام ولا نعم إكا ينا فنيوي إكا يون كباري كبارو اللي يون زخرف القول ولا كما كان يران كما كان تنيار من مليار من كتونيات كان يون نيني زخرف القول غرورا ko shedano kam min ka adama din shedano fanal bo nyama kam won marsa ke kola din din ko won hin
The Sheikh, he says, and next point the Sheikh he mentioned, before that he mentioned a story, he said to point out the fact that these people who they say we can make prayers, we can make dua for you and it will be accepted. He said a story that happened with his own brother. There was a man, when his brother was having issues with his own papers, as people are familiar with that, he was having immigration issues. So there was a man who came to him, he told him, come to me, give me some money, I will pray for you, I will help you if I pray for you, and then your affairs with this, with your immigration affairs will become easy. So he said his brother, he thought about it, he said, but this guy himself is having issues with the immigration. So he told the man, how can you help me to solve my immigration issues by making dua, and you yourself, you could not help yourself by making dua for yourself to solve your own immigration issues? He says, subhanallah. He says, but even that man, he was honest, and then he told the guy, indeed you have spoken the truth. Myself, I cannot help myself with my own immigration issues. Then no doubt I cannot help you. He says, but these people, most of them, they lie to the people and cheat them and pretend like they can help them by making dua for them for things that they themselves cannot help themselves with. He continues, he says, well, dalil isti'adha, and the dalil for seeking this sort of protection from Allah, he says that the scholar, he explained that this isti'adha it means to run away from something that you fear. To run away from something that you fear that will harm you, towards or behind something that will protect you. He said that's what it means. Isti'adha, it means to run away from something that you are scared of, and then you seek protection behind something that will shield you against that thing that you fear. He says, but here in the ayah, he says Allah is reminding us where he says Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq. He says Allah is reminding us in this ayat that when we seek this sort of protection, then we seek it in Allah. We seek this protection from our enemy, the shaitan, because he is our first enemy. He says, as Allah, he says in a different ayah, وَإِمَّا يَنْزَغَنَّكَ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ.
نزغ ما ينزغنك من الشيطان نزغ فاستعذ بالله.
Now he says, Allah, he said in the ayah, and when you receive this sort of deceiving plots and thoughts and ideas, these evil ideas from the devil, these evil thoughts, then seek help in Allah. Seek this sort of protection in Allah. He says, because Allah, he made it clear to us that shaitan is our enemy. He says in a different ayah, Alam ahad ya bani Adam Allah ta'budu shaitan. That indeed, did we not remind you, we told you, we informed you that this devil is your enemy, that do not worship him and take him as an enemy. He said this is why when we start reading the Quran, we start by saying A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We seek this sort of protection from Allah to protect us from that which we fear, the plot of the enemy shaitan, from misleading us and misguiding us and bringing evil thoughts towards us. He says this is why also not only reading Quran but also in the prayer, when the person is praying, he says he is allowed to say this A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. He says even though with the Malinke school, he says that it is said in that school of thought that it is only permissible in the Nawafil prayer. He says, but rather other scholars, they say it is permissible even in your fard prayers. It is permissible to say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim when you start your prayer. He says, but they say it must be said in a low tone, in a low voice. He says Allah, he continues to mention or explain to us, the scholar, he says Allah reminded us that indeed shaitan is our enemy. He says inna shaitan lakum aduun fattakhidhuhu aduwa, that indeed the devil, this shaitan, he's your enemy, so take him as an enemy. He says Allah is reminding us to seek help in him. He says this is what isti'adha means, for us to run away from what we are scared of, this enemy, the shaitan, his plot to deceive us and to misguide us and to run behind Allah to seek his protection from him. He says, because all of mankind, all of us, Allah created us and Allah gave us all enemies. He says, even the prophets, he made enemies for them. He says, وَجَعَلْنَا لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ عَدُوًّا. He says that all the prophets, Allah made enemies for them. He says these enemies, they are from shayateen al-ins wal jinn. They're from the devils of the jinns and the human beings. He says because they are devils among the jinns and they are devils among the human beings as well. He says because all of them, they plot to deceive us. All of them, they plot to mislead us. He says, but our first enemy is shaitan himself. So he comes towards us to mislead us, especially with these evil thoughts and these evil ideas, so that he can take us away. And this is what Allah wants us to run towards him to seek protection in him.
Almamu, isti'aza nyum, fo ruqya nyum be ko non. He very pleased after that he asked.
But after Sinaka, inshallah. نعم. ويجب على المسلم يداوم على الاستعاذة بهما في صباح ومساء. كم دليل من هذا؟ قل أعوذ برب الفلق قل أعوذ برب الناس. يلو جيدا كلا كان صلى الله عليه وسلم قل عليه كافاكو قل كلا فأعوذ بتانكو هنا بأن ألتجئ وأعتصم برب بأن بخالق الفلق بأن الفلق بأن صبح ولم صبالا وكيو من كترجي عندما فجروا فرقوا من كترجي الفلق فالق الحب. نعم الله نور سبحانه وتعالى كتنقول هنا على بريكو سبحان الله نالكم ملياتنا ينفقيس منصومي ينوكا بأن يذهب الظلام ويأتي بالضياء وهو يستعيذ به سبحانه وتعالى. منصومي ينوكا وديبو سامبا كاليرو سامنا أي كلا يأمر ونقرأ أي تنكر نيلو منصوب سبحانه وتعالى كاتن دبولة بنورين والمبين. وقل أعوذ برب الناس كافاكو يتكلا يافو بتنكو ينا برب الناس أي بخالق الناس مية مولدا ولا علتي سبحانه وتعالى. يلكيلا صلى الله عليه وسلم بالمناسبة كبري كيلا كورتي صلى الله عليه وسلم كورتي يا مدن كورتي ومفندتي عند عقيدة أهل السنة والجماعة كان دكو صحيح أمانك شيء خيالي برابك تأثيرك إلا بإذن الله كما عليه من سورة البقرة أخو يتعلمون منهما ما يفرقون به بين المرء وزوجه وما هم بالضارين به من أحد إلا بإذن الله. نيجي السحر نيبا فسر كافوكو الصرف والعطف يالن جام فهمو بدول بول كم ياجي كو صرف ودم حرامت الصرف ولا نيندك مول كولا دين نيون مسونا كيما كو علي افنيام بيس ولا سياده كمسونا كيما تلان اكوي كولا كرام كورتو نيندو ما يفرقون به بين المرء وزوجه أراكو ما هم بالضارين به من أحد إلا بإذن الله. إلا كورتو من كموكلين تورا الله نامن كمن ديات عليه سبحانه وتعالى. تباري إكافة سمي العطف جام يتول جماعة بيجي نكورتو كلا يتول يامر وداتا ولا نيندكو كاجكو كمسون ينكو ينكا ها كمولدون muso malla fi kewla akoy ko malla fi le tefone yamra fo dam mala mu zoti dunya ko wal yadu billah yeta ko ka ko modon e kan ne wala luta ta so fengol bije wallahi ngil mu fennel mi yalan ko mujarrab mi yalan ko nga kalam da nga long akaminke hadama dem subhanallah ni yata ya dundi ila khatamu fengol ngil dada ya kabal ya landi dimba ka ya finjam o muso da khairo so do la fana yo kewji asonno mo ma kanu bara kam na fenne mi alon koy ka forcé ala korte wala na jama nin kewñin nata doro bu ka sabati non nyonka isa bi so muso ala kano man taraji yo ba nin kewñin jam fatal do na ma je doro ikafa kundimo fen bor bu ko cende andem wesi moro yala fam boda ba finja de mo be kandila nyamen dora problème mo khara wala nya nasallallahu salamata wa afiyah am jarala musol be siare ndel ka ba mole naaje nyim farol siare ke wonni musol dem wala mo man la fimi de ba fos la tata yaaje yeta kada yeta de l'akhirata yati so de kaaje ko jawwa bete yata ha do so jang comme ça nga ko modul le pour ka ko mutay jumale ya maro amanke sila de membetea wali ka fasan yen asarfu wal atfu abel haram fendi je mi alan ka data nasallallahu salamata wal afi
the Sheikh he says here the dalil the Sheikh he mentions kul a'udhu bi rabbil falak. Here it is referring Allah is saying Allah sent this down to his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, telling him seek refuge, seek help, seek that protection in your Lord, the one who created the falak, the Lord of the falak. He says this is referring to the lightness that comes after the darkness of the night, the light that comes with fajr, the shining light that comes with fajr. He says this is what the falak is referring to. He says Allah is saying here, seek refuge in him, seek that help, seek that protection in Allah, the creator of this falak. He says the same thing. Allah is saying kul a'udhu bi rabbin nas, seek help, refuge and protection in the Lord of mankind. Allah, the one who created that creation that you see, and from them whom you fear their evil. He says Allah is saying here, seek help in that Allah who created them. He says because these people, they are the one from among the people, the human beings, they cause harm towards other people. He says like those who engage in sihr. He says these are from the creation of Allah, they are from the people. He says but they cause harm among people, like they separate a man and his wife. He says like Allah, he says in the ayah وَيَتَعَلَّمُونَ مَا يُفَرِّقُونَ بِهِ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَزَوْجِهِ, that they learn from the sihr, these magicians, these people, these soothsayers and those who do black magic, they learn that sort of magic that will separate a husband and his wife. He says so they will do that magic and separate the husband and his wife. He says but Allah is reminding us in this ayah that seek protection in him from these evil people. He says why? Because Allah, as he says in that same ayah, وَمَا هُمْ بِضَارِّينَ بِهِ بِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ, they cannot harm anyone with that evil plot that they do, the evil magic that they do. They cannot harm anyone with it except by the will of Allah. He says so it is well known that using black magic to separate the husband and the wife, it is something that is haram. He says but some of these soothsayers, they do not know, or they believe if you use black magic, you use sihr to bring a husband and a wife together. He says they believe or they think that this is permissible. He says some of them, they believe this is allowed, this is permissible. He says but rather it is all haram. Whether you're doing sihr to separate a husband and his wife, or you're doing sihr to make one woman, to force her to love another husband, or to force her to marry another man, he says this is all haram. He says some of them, they believe that if you bring a husband, you force a wife to love her husband or to stay with her husband, they think that this is allowed. He says this is why some of them, they will do this act of magic. He explained it. He says they will take something like a doll, they will stick a needle inside of it, then they will light some fire and they will keep blowing upon it, and as they blowing upon it, the woman, she will keep having troubles, having headaches. She will keep having this sort of punishment upon her until she goes back to that husband that they want her to be with. He says this is why you will find so many people, so many women, they will, when this happens to them, when the husband is away, they cannot have peace. They're always in trouble, they're always under fire, they're always under headaches, they're always under issues. He says but when the husband comes back, all those problems, they go away. But even when the husband comes back, they cannot live with that husband. He says because why? The woman was forced to love that husband, or she was forced to marry him, but she doesn't want to marry him. And he says this is another reason why you find so many marriages, one partner will kill the other partner. Because he says because why? They were forced to be with that person. So once they didn't want to be with them, then they resorted to killing one another. He says this is why it's not permissible to force people to marry others. He says no, he stops there.
Now, wato thinking about it, Fembi Jamia and Kakumaya to just left is the other in Tonguanyamba. Now, Kila Yima sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, I Ukubun Amir Yamara Kurka, Tankanyo Kanin, Sora Fulun in Naki Karam, Pul Audu, the Rabbil Falati, Pul Audu Rabinas. As I wanted to assume Kila sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Nibine Lalake Buluflo, Ya Landi, Buluflo. ye kul huwa karange sinya sawanin kul a'udhu rabbil falaq kul a'udhu rabbin nas akwai ya suma susai balo mu mebel kila ko sallallahu عليه وسلم وفنان على حسن وحسين أكافا أعيذكما بكلمات الله التامة من كل شيطان وهامة من كل عين لامة ñila fi siata janni bita safo sidla dinnan wala ye yiro sita bala ye nefi ma be jawyar nefi mo taso adi umur shirkiyat yewol kala awdo furka tanka ibida be am kumula sidlela ila bundal ibe nyum fundu wulam bala tale be sidla je pour yetan kila ko yinga sallallahu alaihi wasallam ni be dunna hadiya bumba de ko bismillah yede maro nyina ala do shaytanu buka ende o bumunya abora nyani be do moro le ko bismillah abu ko do moro do moy fe ibe fam fe ko bismillah shaytanu aka la ta ngi jando moro tan de kila min ko sallallahu alaihi wasallam wala mutankarram ay fam ko do wakila ko sallallahu alaihi wasallam ako man nazala manzilan فقال أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات من شر ما خلق لم يضره شيء حتى يرتهل من منزله ذلك رواه مسلم والله بعد نلي ما نرى كلا صلى الله عليه وسلم e baaje la ko nakku jamal be jena problème jamal be solfa molte tulu nan sonno mon jira mo sunno kila ko sallallahu alaihi wasallam kila ko akoni momo e jitam la de tata tamadula hana wulo kono de jita iko a'udhu bi kalimati llahi tamma betan karuniro kala arabula la kuma kana min be timmare min sharri ma khalaqa famu fen ari ada dala toro betan ko nyina arabu ako lam yadurruhu shay'un ako fenta tora la fen shay fende tora la gina da madin den hatta yartahila min manzilihi dhalika fo yebo ila wallahi imam al-qurtubi jube jam imam al-qurtubi rahimahu sahibu tafsir misle mol yenda kada la spene banko kada no muslima banko ha misle mol je ma 300 years ni da de kanyum qurtuba qur'e kawlo qurtuja ha lon na jelle bota je tafsirati ibn Abdul Barri ñol bota je ibn Hazm ñol bota ja siyat al-Baji Abu Walid al-Baji wal be bota jelt nasallallahu salamatu wal afiya ako hada khabarun sahihun ako ñi mo kibaro mi mo tonya wa qawlun sadiq ako annum kuma kan tonya mala alimnahu alimna sidqahu ako ngala tonyalo na dalilo to ko cilala ko sallallahu alaihi wasallam dalilo sahadal wa tajribanin ko to boro fananta fa inni mundu sami'tu hadha al-khabar ako tembo men de nyin kibaro nyum mo hadithu nyum moy amiltu alayhi ako nga ado kundile falam yadurruni shay'un ako fennena mantora ila an taraktahu follu min ngatu lundo la nyina ako fala dagani aqrabun bil mahdiyya wala espere banko nyingam e ka ko dinkira do madinatul anabi bilad al andalus ka fal mahdiyya ako bundalo nata bunni ha ako laylan suto fatafakkartu fi nafsi ako ngamiram fandu fa idha bi qad nasitu an ata'awwadha bi tilka al kalimat ako yaran nyina tale man kuma ko nyanta maka so worat ne ngamuru nyinkam nyillel da hande janne molbe tulune le bela do ko be kala jela nyim bata sum yallim fangol e ka fo ko bidaw be dila morol len wolle bo fengel be safolo fengele be pol fengele nasallallahu salamata wal afiya na yen dole mu fenne de yakare fo ya tanka ila din nulu at jalla safol bino baso la karodu en yaaje nasallallahu salamata wal afiya.
The Sheikh he says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam he advised Uqba bin Amir to read these two surahs, Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq and Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas, to seek help in Allah and to seek protection in Allah. He says reading this will save you and this will protect you if the person reads this. He says the same thing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to seek help in Allah or seek protection in Allah for his two grandsons. He used to say
أعوذكما بكلمات الله التامة من كل شيطان وهام ومن كل عين لامة.
He used to seek refuge and protection in Allah for his two grandchildren. He used to seek refuge and protection in Allah from shaitan and from every evil eye. The Sheikh he says this is better for you to say these dua, to say these ayat, to seek help in Allah, rather than going out to these magicians to make these knots for you. You're tying it around your head and your neck, tying it around your kids. He says this will not protect them. You're harming them and you're making them bleed. You're using these horns and doing all those things that these magicians are asking you to do. He says the same thing the Prophet he said in the hadith that the one who says that dua seeking refuge in Allah, he says if he travels or goes to a desert or any other place, nothing will be able to harm him until he leaves that place. He says a story of Imam al-Qurtubi when he was in Spain. He says, and this was a place, a land of the Muslims. He says when he used to say this dua, one day he forgot to say the dua. When he forgot to say it, he was hit by a bullet, I think.
Scorpion.
He was hit by a scorpion, and then he thought about it, he reflected, and then he said, he realized that he forgot to say the dua, and this is why that thing happened to him. He says, so it is enough for the person to seek help in Allah, to seek refuge and protection in Allah by saying these ayat, saying these duas, instead of going to seek help in people who cannot help you, and you're tying these knots. He asks Allah to protect all of us.
Akamenda ni jam wala sayet la dankene anila la kila sallallahu alaihi wasallam bes ning ila da kila sallallahu alaihi wasallam ko to nyamona madabuka kuma ken sam ko ay min boy nyanda lalawa andu wallahi ni la taala ibaje da wala nyam comme beli alon ko kalaji morolo la ka wol milita mandi ikala ilal kaje ko to nyana mat wala na ala ke ne je comme say ko koliri yaje yo ning ada ila kila la nyama sallallahu alaihi wasallam ta jarle be sabol sitila yo bari so no wala man la sunna limani akila sallallahu wa shahadatu anna muhammad rasulullah naso ni bije nasallallahu salamata wal afiya kullu ma qulnahu ma kana sawaban fa min allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wa ma kana min